The glimpse through the glass. The low hum of the patrol car's engine echoed against the empty highway, only interrupted by the occasional gust of wind that rattled dry leaves across the pavement. Officer Jake Holloway had adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a brief glimpse of his own tired eyes, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. It was the weight of too many years on the force, too many calls that didn't end with a neat resolution, and too many nights spent driving roads where memories lurked just out of sight. The sky had blurred into deep navy, that fleeting space between dusk and true night. It was his least favorite time, the in-between hour, where the world felt suspended and ghosts had room to breathe. A flash of taillights caught his attention up ahead. The car was idling awkwardly at the shoulder, a beat-up sedan, dark blue or black, difficult to tell in the dimming light. No hazard lights, no signs of distress, just there. Jake slowed, flicked on his lights, and eased onto the gravel beside the vehicle. The uneven crunch beneath his tires was oddly loud in the stillness. His hand found the familiar grip of his flashlight as he stepped out into the cooling air, boots scuffing against cracked asphalt. Routine, he told himself. Probably just some kid with a busted radiator or a couple arguing over directions. He'd done this 1,000 times before. The driver's side window was down halfway, a thin hand resting against the door. The driver was a man in his early 50s, pale skin, greasy thinning hair plastered to his scalp, and eyes that refused to meet Jake's gaze. There was a faint tremble in the man's fingers, though he tried to disguise it by clenching the steering wheel too tightly. "Evening, sir." Jake's voice was professional, calm. "Everything all right?" The man nodded a little too quickly. Yeah, just stretching my legs. Car's fine." His voice was reedy, the kind that tried too hard to sound casual. Jake's eyes drifted past him to the back seat, and then everything stopped. He felt the breath leave his lungs like a punch to the gut. His fingers slackened on the flashlight, which nearly slipped from his grip. Sitting in the back seat was his son. His son, Matthew Holloway. The same Matthew he had buried 2 years ago, standing under a steel-gray sky with his ex-wife sobbing into her hands. The same Matthew who had drowned in the lake near their family cabin, his sneaker washing up days later like some cruel reminder. The same Matthew whose funeral photos still sat on Jake's mantle, grinning in his high school baseball uniform. But there he was. The boy's face was pale but unmistakable, freckles scattered across his nose, the same stubborn cowlick at his temple. His wide brown eyes locked with Jake's, filled with shock, terror, and something deeper, recognition. Matthew. The name was a whisper, torn from Jake's throat before he could stop it. The driver's knuckles turned white around the wheel. "There's no one in the back," the man said quickly, his voice climbing an octave. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the boy's face. No, this wasn't some trick of memory. It wasn't a lookalike or some twisted dream. Matthew was there, alive, breathing. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. His training, decades of it, fought to claw its way back to the surface, but it couldn't compete with the rising tide of confusion, anger, and hope threatening to drown him. "Step out of the car," Jake ordered, his voice harder now, the cop in him clawing its way back up. Now. The man didn't move at first, eyes darting toward the rearview mirror, his face a map of growing panic. Jake's hand drifted toward his holster. "I said step out." The driver's door creaked as it opened. The man emerged slowly, his shoulders hunched inward like he was trying to disappear into himself. His clothes were stained and rumpled, the kind of clothes someone wore for days without a change. There was dirt under his fingernails, a crust of something dried on his sleeve. His whole body practically screamed guilt. Jake's gaze flicked back to the rear seat, where Matthew still sat frozen, wide-eyed and unmoving. The flashlight beam trembled slightly. "Get out of the car, son," Jake said, softer now. "Come here." The boy's hands, small and thin, curled into fists in his lap. His chest rose and fell quickly, breathing too fast. But after a long moment, he obeyed, his movements stiff, mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Jake's breath caught as Matthew stepped into the pale glow of the cruiser's headlights. He was thinner than Jake remembered, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. There was a faint bruise along his jaw, a healed cut just below his collarbone. His shoes were too small, his laces frayed to threads, but it was him. Jake knew his own son, no matter how impossible. "Matthew," Jake whispered again, the name fragile in the night air. How is this?" The boy's lower lip trembled. His eyes flicked to the driver, then back to Jake. The driver took half a step forward, panic crackling off him like static. "Look, I can explain. Hands where I can see them," Jake barked, training finally taking the wheel. His hand hovered just above his holster, but part of him didn't trust himself not to shake. The man's hands shot up, trembling fingers splayed wide. "It's not what you think," the driver stammered. It's complicated." Complicated didn't cover it. Jake's heart was beating too fast, the pieces in his mind scattered like broken glass. His son, his dead son standing in front of him, too thin, too pale, but alive. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, the question aimed squarely at the driver. "What the hell is going on here?" The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a buoy in a storm. I was trying to save him." Jake's pulse roared in his ears. Save him? From who? The man's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, from the darkness beyond the car, a sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Jake's flashlight swung toward the sound, catching only the briefest glimpse of movement. A figure slipping back into the tree line, too quick to follow. Matthew flinched at the sound, his hands twitching toward his sides like he wanted to cover his ears. The fear in his eyes sharpened, something feral and raw. That was the moment Jake realized Matthew hadn't just been found. He'd been taken, and whoever had taken him, they were still out there. Shadows between the trees. The moment the figure vanished into the woods, Jake's training screamed at him to pursue. Every muscle in his body tensed, adrenaline flooding his veins, begging him to run into the trees, to chase down whoever had taken his son, to end this nightmare with the weight of his badge and gun in his hands. But Matthew. The boy stood shivering, too small in the pool of yellow headlights, the ghost of a child Jake had tried for 2 years to mourn. That was what kept him rooted in place. Whoever was out there, they'd already stolen enough time. Matthew was here now. Jake wasn't leaving his son again, not for anything. The trembling driver shifted nervously, eyes flicking between the woods and the road like a trapped animal. "We don't have much time," the man said, voice quivering. "They'll come back. They always do." Jake's head snapped around. "Who?" His voice was a growl, all the buried grief surfacing as something sharp-edged and lethal. "Who's coming back?" The man's lips parted, but no words emerged, only a dry, rattling sound, like all the moisture had been drained from him. His entire body sagged, and for a moment, Jake thought he might collapse right there on the gravel. Matthew shifted a step closer to Jake. That small, almost imperceptible movement, a child gravitating toward safety, shattered something inside Jake. The questions could wait. He holstered his gun, dropping into a crouch, arms out. Matthew hesitated, then stumbled into him. Jake's hands closed around his son's thin shoulders, solid and real and shaking like a leaf. The boy smelled faintly of sweat and earth, a scent Jake recognized instantly. The smell of someone who'd spent far too long outside alone. He wasn't ready for the sob that tore out of him, unbidden and raw. He pressed Matthew into his chest, arms tightening like if he let go even a little, his son might dissolve back into the shadows. Matthew didn't cry, but his fingers dug into Jake's uniform like an anchor. The driver shifted again, the gravel crunching under his worn sneakers. "I didn't take him," he said quickly. "I swear. I was trying to." "Shut up," Jake ground out, his voice low, shaking with fury he could barely contain. "We're not doing this here." He reached for his radio, thumbing the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need immediate backup and medical at mile marker 147 off Route 9. Minor found, possible abduction victim. Suspect in custody. Over." A burst of static filled the silence, followed by the calm voice of the dispatcher. "Copy that, Unit 12. Backup en route. ETA 7 minutes." 10-4. Jake lowered the radio, looking the driver square in the eye. "You so much as twitch wrong before backup gets here, and I'll put you on the ground so fast you won't even know you fell." The man swallowed hard and nodded. Jake turned his attention back to Matthew, who hadn't let go. His son's ribs pressed too hard against Jake's arm. Too thin, too fragile. "Hey, buddy," Jake whispered, tipping Matthew's chin up so he could see his face. "It's okay now. I've got you. No one's taking you away again. I promise." The boy's lip quivered, but he didn't speak. His eyes flicked past Jake's shoulder, back toward the trees. There was something in that look that made Jake's stomach knot. Fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition. Before Jake could follow that thread, the rumble of approaching engines broke the silence. Red and blue lights washed over the dark road as 2 patrol cars and an ambulance skidded to a halt. Gravel flew in sprays from the tires, and doors popped open almost in unison. Deputy Carla Reeves, a woman Jake had known since she was a rookie fresh out of the academy, approached first. Her brow furrowed the instant her flashlight swept over the scene. The shaking kid clinging to Jake, the wild-eyed man by the car, and Jake's own pale, stricken face. "Jesus," she whispered. "Is that?" Jake gave a small, tight nod. "Matthew," he said, the word like a prayer and curse all at once. "My son." Her eyes widened, but she was too professional to let her shock slow her down. "Let's get the kid in the ambulance. EMTs can check him over while we sort the rest out." Jake didn't want to let go, but Matthew's trembling was growing worse. And the kid was cold, dangerously cold. Jake carried him to the waiting ambulance, speaking low reassurances the whole way. He felt his son's small hand clutching at his uniform sleeve the whole time, like Matthew was afraid Jake would disappear if he let go. Once the paramedics settled Matthew into the back, wrapping him in warm blankets, Jake lingered at the edge of the open doors. His son's wide, haunted eyes tracked him, not daring to blink. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake promised. "I'll be right here, okay?" Matthew's lips parted for a moment, like he might speak, but then he just nodded and curled deeper into the blankets, the tremors never fully stopping. Interrogation on the side of the road. Back at the Sedan, Deputy Reeves had the driver against the hood, hands cuffed behind his back. Jake approached, emotions simmering just below the surface. "Name," Jake said curtly. The man licked his cracked lips. "Eddie Vickers." "You know who that boy is." Jake's voice was sharp enough to cut. Eddie hesitated. "I do now. I didn't before tonight." "Start talking." Eddie's gaze flicked toward the trees. "We should be doing this somewhere else," he muttered. "They're watching." Jake's patience snapped. He grabbed the front of Eddie's jacket and slammed him back against the hood. "There is no they," Jake growled. "You kidnapped my son, and you're gonna answer for it." "I didn't." Eddie yelped, eyes wide with terror. "I found him, I swear. I was trying to get him away from them." "From who?" "Them," Eddie whispered. "The people from the lake." Jake froze, blood turning to ice in his veins. "The lake." His voice was low, dangerous. "That lake, up near your family's old cabin," Eddie said, his eyes darting to the woods again, like the trees themselves could hear him. "I was camping nearby a few months ago. Saw some weird stuff. Strange lights at night. People whispering in the trees. And then I found him, wandering along the shoreline, like he didn't know where he was." Jake's mouth went dry. Matthew had drowned at that lake. Search teams had scored the shoreline for days before finding his shoe, but no body. You're telling me you just found him? Alive? Eddie nodded frantically. He didn't talk much, just stared at the water like something was calling him back. I took him with me, figured I'd get him to someone safe, but every time I tried, they found us. Who? Jake shouted, shaking him. Eddie's eyes gleamed with something close to madness. The ones from the lake. The ones who took him in the first place. Jake's hand loosened just slightly on Eddie's collar. The words were crazy, but there was a tremor in Eddie's voice. Not the tremor of a liar. The tremor of a man terrified down to his marrow. How long? Jake asked, his throat tight. How long have you had him? Eddie's shoulders slumped. A few months. Maybe longer. Time got weird after a while. Jake's stomach churned. 2 years. His son had been gone for 2 years. How could Eddie have only had him for a few months? Before Jake could press further, Matthew's scream pierced the night. Jake whirled, sprinting toward the ambulance, and froze. The woods beyond the highway were glowing, a soft, unnatural blue light shimmering between the trees. And Matthew was staring at it, face pale with terror. What the water took. The moment Jake saw the unnatural blue light seeping through the trees, the world shifted beneath him. It was the same disorienting feeling he'd experienced 2 years ago, when they'd found Matthew's waterlogged sneaker washed ashore, a sense that reality itself had tilted just enough to be wrong, but not enough for anyone else to notice. But Matthew noticed, even now wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, his body trembling. Jake could see his son's face go slack with that same terrified recognition. His wide eyes reflected the pale blue glow, like the light reached into his memories and stirred something too deep to name. Keep him here, Jake barked at the nearest EMT. Don't let him out of your sight. Then he ran. His boots pounded the gravel shoulder, then crunched into damp leaves and earth as he crossed into the tree line. The air was colder here, too cold for early autumn. The blue light pulsed, faint at first, but growing stronger the deeper he went, painting the bark of the trees in eerie glimmers. Jake's radio crackled at his hip, Reeves' voice slicing through the static. Jake, what the hell is that light? No idea, he panted, weaving between tree trunks. Stay with the kid and the suspect. Don't come after me unless I call for backup. Copy that, Reeves replied, but her voice held a note of hesitation. Be careful. Jake didn't answer. His heart was beating too fast, the adrenaline washing out any semblance of rationality. All he could think about was the lake where Matthew had drowned, or hadn't drowned. The ground sloped downward, the trees thinning, until the water came into view, a glassy expanse under the moonlight, the surface unnaturally still, almost too perfect, like a photograph of a lake rather than water itself. Tendrils of mist curled above it, disturbed only by the faintest ripples near the shore. And standing at the edge, just at the boundary where earth became water, was a woman. Jake skidded to a halt. Breath caught painfully in his chest. Her back was to him, long dark hair hanging in damp strands down her back, clinging to a white dress that was stained at the hem with mud. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, fingers twitching slightly, like she was trying to hold on to something invisible. There was something horribly familiar about her, but Jake couldn't place it. Ma'am, Jake called, his voice steady despite the crawling sense of wrongness in his gut. This is a restricted area. Please step away from the water. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. Her feet shifted slightly in the mud, toes sinking deeper as if the earth itself was trying to claim her. The light was brightest around her, a soft blue aura that made the water beneath her glow faintly. Jake took a cautious step forward, his hand drifting toward his holster. I need you to. She spoke, quiet, almost a whisper, but her voice carried easily across the still water. You were supposed to leave him. Jake froze. The voice, it was familiar. But not just familiar. It was Maddie's voice, his ex-wife. His throat went dry. "What did you say?" The woman's head tilted slightly, just enough for him to catch the pale sliver of her profile. It wasn't Maddie. The features were too sharp, the skin too smooth, too cold. But the voice, when it came again, was unmistakable. "You were supposed to leave him with us." Jake's gun was in his hand now, though his grip was slippery with sweat. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse. "What do you mean? Leave him?" The woman's shoulders rose and fell with a slow, unnatural rhythm, like she was breathing in sync with the lake. "We saved him," she said softly. "We brought him back when the water took him. You shouldn't have interfered." Jake took another step closer, boots sinking into the mud. "Who's we?" His mind spun. Cult, traffickers, some lunatic commune hiding out in the woods. The woman's head turned fully now, and Jake's stomach clenched. Her eyes were black. Not dark brown, not shadowed. Black, like twin pools of water that swallowed all light. And even though the face was unfamiliar, she was wearing Maddie's smile. Jake's fingers trembled on the trigger. "Where's my son?" The smile deepened, stretching her mouth into something too wide, too forced. "He was never yours to keep." The trees rustled behind him. Footsteps. Jake spun, gun raised, but no one was there. When he turned back to the shore, the woman was gone. Only the faint mist remained, curling like fingers along the surface. The blue light dimmed, the unnatural glow bleeding back into the moonlight. The lake returned to its eerie stillness, but Jake stood frozen, heart hammering so hard it hurt. His knees threatened to buckle, the weight of it all. Matthew, the light, the woman wearing his ex-wife's smile, pressing down until he couldn't breathe. A whisper echoed through the trees. Faint, childlike. "Don't follow us." The voice belonged to Matthew. Jake stumbled back up the slope, tripping over roots and stones, half blinded by adrenaline and confusion. He broke through the tree line just as Reeves reached him, her flashlight beam cutting a white path through the gloom. "What the hell happened?" she demanded. Jake could only shake his head, breathing hard, the gun still clutched in his hand. "Where's Matthew?" Jake's voice cracked as he spoke. "Still in the ambulance," Reeves said. "But he's—" She trailed off, her face pinched with concern. "He's what?" Jake snapped, marching toward the emergency lights. Reeves fell into step beside him. "He keeps asking about the lake, but he's not making sense. Something about the voices in the water, and the ones who followed him back." Jake's stomach knotted. Matthew had barely spoken since they found him, but of course now he was talking about them. The ones Eddie had mentioned. The ones who took him. Jake climbed into the back of the ambulance, where Matthew was still huddled under a blanket. His skin had a faint sheen of sweat, and his eyes flicked toward the tree line, even though the ambulance doors were shut. "Hey, buddy." Jake sat beside him, forcing calm into his voice. "You're safe now." "I'm right here." Matthew's hand crept out from the blanket, fingers curling weakly around Jake's wrist. His grip was cold, the skin too clammy for a child his age. "I didn't mean to go with them," Matthew whispered. "They said it would only be for a little while. But the water was so cold, Dad." Jake's breath hitched, his throat too tight to speak. Matthew's voice grew smaller, more fragile. "They said I belong to them now. But I got away. I ran. But they're mad. They said if you took me back, they'd follow." Jake's hands curled into fists. "No one's taking you again," he promised fiercely. "I don't care who they are. They're not getting near you." Matthew didn't look comforted. His gaze remained fixed on the distant tree line, where the blue light had fully faded. "They always find us," Matthew whispered. The ambulance door creaked open, and Eddie Vickers' wild-eyed face appeared, his mouth twisted into a desperate smile. "They let him leave," Eddie rasped, "but they always take something back." Before Jake could react, Eddie's body convulsed. His mouth opened too wide, and water poured out. His eyes rolled back, veins bulging and turning dark under his skin as his body folded inward, collapsing like a marionette with cut strings. Jake reached for Matthew, pulling his son close as Eddie's lifeless body hit the dirt. Somewhere, deep in the woods, the lake rippled. And from the shadows, something watched. When the water calls your name. The wet, sloshing sound of water pouring from Eddie Vickers' mouth would haunt Jake Holloway for the rest of his life. It wasn't normal. It wasn't like someone choking or vomiting water. No, this was different. The water came with purpose, as if it had been hiding inside him, waiting for release. It soaked the gravel beneath Eddie's twitching body, a dark stain spreading wider with each grotesque pulse. And it was cold. Jake could feel it radiating even from several feet away, a coldness that didn't belong to this world. Jake yanked Matthew into his arms, shielding his son's face from the sight. But Matthew didn't fight to see. The boy had squeezed his eyes shut the second Eddie collapsed, like he already knew what was happening. Reeves staggered back from the body, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "What the hell is that?" Jake couldn't answer. His mind was a storm, thoughts slamming into each other. The lake, the woman with black eyes, the blue light, the thing Eddie had been so terrified of. And now Eddie was dead, the water inside him spilling back out like it was reclaiming him. "They're mad." Matthew's voice was barely a whisper, muffled against Jake's chest. "They don't like when we leave." Jake swallowed hard, his hand cradling the back of Matthew's head. "Who, buddy? Who's mad?" But Matthew only shook his head, curling in tighter. The EMT stood frozen nearby, unsure whether to tend to Eddie's body or flee. The air itself felt heavier, the night thick with something Jake couldn't name. "Reeves," Jake said sharply, trying to ground himself in something real, something procedural. "Call the coroner. Get CSU out here." Reeves was still pale, her eyes glued to the widening puddle of water seeping into the dirt. "What do I even list as cause of death?" "Start with drowning," Jake said grimly. "We'll figure out the rest later. The legend nobody talks about." The next 2 hours passed in a haze of flashing lights, plastic evidence markers, and murmured theories that all felt useless. The coroner's assistant poked at Eddie's body, shaking his head with the kind of disbelief Jake usually reserved for UFO reports or Bigfoot sightings. But none of them, not the coroner, not Reeves, not even Jake, wanted to get too close to the puddle of water around Eddie. It hadn't soaked into the dirt like normal water should. It just sat there, shimmering faintly, like it was alive. Jake barely heard the questions or the reports. His attention was locked on the ambulance, where Matthew sat, knees pulled to his chest, wrapped in a blanket that couldn't seem to warm him. Every time someone got too close, Matthew flinched, his eyes flicking toward the tree line. Jake knew that look. He'd seen it in veterans returning from combat, in kids rescued from cult compounds. It was the look of someone who knew they weren't safe, couldn't be safe, no matter how far they ran. When the scene was finally cleared, Jake drove Matthew back to his house. His hands were white-knuckled on the wheel the whole drive, the silence between them suffocating. He wanted to ask questions. Needed to. What happened at the lake? Who took you? Why didn't you come home? How are you still alive? But Matthew's hands were shaking in his lap, his fingers twitching as if brushing against something invisible, and Jake couldn't bring himself to ask. Not yet. When they reached the house, Jake settled Matthew onto the couch, tucked a thick quilt around him, and sat beside him, close but not crowding. "You want some cocoa?" Jake asked softly. Matthew shook his head. Jake leaned back, exhaustion dragging at his bones. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak sound like a gunshot. "You remember the cabin?" Jake asked after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's fingers curled into the blanket. "I remember the water," he said softly. "I remember the voices under it." Jake's stomach clenched. "What voices?" Matthew's eyes flicked toward the window. even though the curtains were drawn tight, the ones that sang. A history of drowning. The next morning, Jake left Matthew sleeping in his room and drove back to the station. Reeves was waiting, a thick folder clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, eyes bloodshot. She hadn't slept either. "You're not gonna believe this," she said without preamble, dropping the folder onto his desk. Jake flipped it open, eyes scanning old newspaper clippings, half-faded police reports, and handwritten notes that looked like they'd been scrawled in a hurry. All of it centered around Black Hollow Lake. The lake where Matthew had drowned. The lake where Eddie had found him. The lake where the water never gave back the same thing it took. "These go back 50 years, Reeves said, rubbing the back of her neck. "Disappearances. Bodies found days or weeks later. Except they weren't always the same." Jake frowned. "What do you mean, not the same?" Reeves flipped to a specific clipping. 1967, an old black and white photo of a woman standing at the edge of the lake, clutching a child to her chest. The headline read, "Boy returns after 9 days missing. Claims the lake spoke to him." "His name was Peter Halloran," Reeves said. "Went missing for 9 days. His parents assumed he drowned. When he came back, he remembered nothing except voices in the water calling his name." Jake skimmed further down the page, his pulse quickening. "The weird part," Reeves added, "is that his parents swore the kid they got back wasn't exactly their son." Jake's stomach turned. "What does that mean?" Reeves hesitated, then produced a series of autopsy reports. "Peter died when he was 30, she said quietly. "The coroner found abnormalities. Scar tissue in his lungs that didn't match any prior injuries, organs that didn't quite match his medical records. It was like," she trailed off, searching for the words, "like something put him back together wrong." Jake finished, his throat tight. Reeves nodded grimly. Jake closed the folder, the weight of it pressing against his chest. "And Matthew?" Reeves's face softened. "We don't know yet, but if the lake took him and something sent him back, you need to be ready for the possibility that he's not exactly the son you lost. The lake remembers." That night, Jake sat beside Matthew's bed, watching his son sleep. His face was soft in the moonlight, peaceful in a way Jake hadn't seen since before the accident. But even in sleep, Matthew's fingers twitched, as if brushing against something unseen. At 3:17 a.m., Matthew bolted upright, gasping for air. Jake was there in an instant, hands on his son's shoulders. "It's okay. It's okay. You're home. You're safe." Matthew's eyes darted wildly, taking in the room, the blankets, his father's face. "I heard them," he whispered. Jake swallowed hard. "Who?" "Them," Matthew said, voice barely audible. "They're in the pipes now. In the water. They said I was theirs. Dad." Jake's heart pounded, ice pooling in his gut. "And they said they're coming back to get me." Somewhere deep in the house, the pipes groaned, and the faintest sound of a whisper echoed through them, too low to make out, but unmistakably there. The house had never felt smaller, and the lake had never felt closer. The house that remembers the water. The whispering started small. At first, Jake convinced himself it was just the house settling. Old pipes groaning, the soft pop of wood expanding with the shift of autumn air. Houses did that, especially ones like his, built decades before insulation and craftsmanship stopped cutting corners. But then the whispers started sounding like words. They slithered through the walls when the house was quiet, rising just beneath the hum of the refrigerator or the distant wail of a siren down the road. They were too faint to understand, too slippery to hold on to, like a dream you half remember after waking. Except Matthew heard them too. The boy sat at the kitchen table the next morning, his hands wrapped tight around a mug of untouched cocoa. His shoulders hunched inward like someone expecting a blow, eyes locked on the corner where the baseboard met the wall. Jake followed his gaze, seeing nothing but cracked paint and shadow. But Matthew whispered, "They're still in there." Jake's stomach clenched. "Who?" Matthew's eyes flicked toward him, pupils too wide for the morning light. The ones who pulled me under. Jake's knuckles went white against the edge of the table. You remember. His voice was hoarse, unsure whether he wanted to hear the answer. Matthew's grip tightened on the mug, cocoa sloshing against the sides. I didn't, at first, but they talked to me through the pipes now. They told me they only let me leave to bring them something back. Jake's throat turned dry. Something back. Matthew didn't answer, but his hands trembled harder. The whispering under the floorboards seemed to chuckle. The phone call. At noon, Jake made a call he'd been avoiding for 2 days. The line rang 5 times before Maddie's voice, tired, older than he remembered, filled the silence. Hello. Jake cleared his throat. It's me. A long pause. Jake? He swallowed. I found him. The silence stretched so long, Jake thought the call had dropped. Then, barely above a whisper, what did you say? Matthew, Jake said, throat tightening. I found Matthew. The sound Maddie made was something between a gasp and a sob. Then breathless silence. Jake, that's not funny. I'm not joking. His fingers dug into the kitchen counter. He's here. He's alive. But there's something wrong. She didn't answer right away. He could hear the TV in the background, some daytime show playing at low volume. When she spoke again, her voice shook. I can be there in 4 hours. Jake hesitated. He didn't want Maddie to see what Matthew had become, the skittish, silent boy who flinched at running faucets and refused to sleep without a light on. But if anyone deserved to know, it was her. Come, Jake said softly. Just be ready. Things in the pipes. By the time Maddie arrived, the whispers had grown bolder. The kitchen sink gurgled when no one used it. The upstairs toilet flushed itself once at midnight, and when Jake lifted the lid to check the tank, the water inside was black, and something shifted just beneath the surface. Matthew refused to shower. Instead, he stood at the sink, washing his face with bottled water. His hands shook so badly Jake had to help him, holding a towel under his chin as his son whispered over and over, "They're watching through the drains. They're always watching." Jake unplugged the bathroom sink. It didn't help. At 9:17 p.m., Maddie's car pulled into the driveway. Jake stood at the door, watching her step out. The same woman he'd married once, loved once. Grief had carved deeper lines into her face than time ever could. Her hair, once golden, was streaked with gray, and her movements were careful, like someone always bracing for bad news. When she saw Jake standing there, her breath caught. Is he? Jake just stepped aside, letting her into the house. Matthew sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest, the blanket wound so tightly around him he looked cocooned. His head snapped up when the door opened, his eyes locking onto Maddie. Her hands flew to her mouth. Matthew. Her voice broke. Oh my God. Matthew. She rushed forward, collapsing onto the couch beside him, her hands cupping his face. Matthew stiffened, caught between confusion and recognition. But then, slowly, his hand slid out from the blanket and rested on hers. Maddie's sob broke free, loud and raw. Jake turned away, giving them a moment, his own chest tight with grief and guilt and relief. His son was home. But what had come home with him? The pipes groaned, low and guttural, like something breathing beneath the house. Maddie's truth. An hour later, Matthew was asleep, or at least pretending to be, curled up on the couch. Maddie stood in the kitchen, hands trembling as she clutched a mug of coffee. Jake. Her voice was soft, but urgent. I need to tell you something. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Go ahead. She took a shaky breath. The night Matthew went missing at the lake, I heard something. I never told you because it sounded crazy, and I thought maybe the grief just made me imagine it. But I heard it. Jake's stomach clenched. What? A voice, she whispered, calling his name. It was coming from the water. And I swear, It sounded like my own voice. Jake's blood went cold. And after they found his shoe, after they told us he was gone, Maddie continued, I kept having dreams. Dreams of him standing at the edge of the lake. But every time I called to him, he wouldn't come. He just stood there like he was waiting for something. Jake's mind spun. The woman at the water's edge, the one with Maddie's smile. They took her voice. They said I was theirs, Matthew had whispered. Maddie, Jake said slowly, we need to talk about the lake. The history that never left. At 2:17 a.m., Jake stood in his basement. The pipes along the ceiling ticked and thumped like something was crawling through them. The air was damp, the smell of old water seeping into the concrete. He crouched by the main pipe where it fed into the house, placing his ear against the cold metal. The whisper was louder here. He belongs to us. The water took him. The water gave him back. The debt must be paid. Jake stood so fast he nearly fell. The whispers didn't stop. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox, braced himself, and slammed it into the pipe. The whisper turned into a shriek. Water spewed from a crack, but it wasn't clear. It was black, slick with some oily sheen, and something moved inside it, writhing. Jake staggered back, heart pounding, as the water pooled on the floor. Shapes rippled beneath the surface. Hands, fingers, reaching for him before dissolving back into liquid. Upstairs, Matthew screamed. A choice in the dark. Jake thundered up the stairs, wrench still in hand. He burst into the living room, where Matthew was sitting bolt upright, his hands over his ears. They're coming, Matthew cried. They said you broke the promise. What promise? Jake shouted, heart pounding. What did they make you promise, Matthew? Matthew's eyes filled with tears. I told them I'd stay if they let me see you one last time. Jake's stomach bottomed out. A cold breeze swept through the house, even though every door and window was locked tight. Water seeped from the vents, the walls, the floorboards, thin streams winding together, pulling toward the center of the room, where they began to form something. A shape, human-like, but wrong. Its eyes were black pools, its smile stretched too wide. And it wore Matthew's face. Jake raised the wrench, but his hands were shaking. The voice came from all around him, from the walls, the floors, the pipes, the lake itself. The water never gives without taking. And then it reached for Matthew. What the water gave and took. The shape in the middle of Jake Holloway's living room wore his son's face, but it wasn't Matthew. It stood in the dim glow from the street lamp outside, skin glistening like something freshly pulled from the bottom of the lake, water still pooling at its bare feet. Its hands were too long, fingers tapering into points. Its mouth hung slightly open, revealing a smile that was somehow both identical to Matthew's and nothing like it at all. Matthew's voice echoed softly, layered and distorted. The water gives, and the water takes. Jake's grip on the wrench tightened until his knuckles burned, but the tool felt useless, like bringing a paper shield to a gunfight. Behind him, Matthew sat on the couch, clutching the blanket to his chest, wide-eyed and trembling. "Stay back," Jake barked, stepping between his son and the thing that had crawled out of the pipes. "You can't have him." The shape cocked its head, its neck moving with an unnatural watery crackle. The whispering sound rose again, not from its mouth but from inside it, as if the thing was a hollow vessel filled with all the drowned voices the lake had ever claimed. "He belongs to us." Jake's throat tightened. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "He's my son." The thing's smile stretched wider, skin pulling too tight, the sound of wet paper tearing. It had Matthew's face, but the eyes were all wrong. Black and endless, like staring into the heart of the lake itself. "The water returned him to you," it whispered, "but debts must be paid." Jake's mind reeled. Pieces snapped together like a broken puzzle mending itself. Whatever took Matthew that day at the lake, it never meant to keep him forever. It was a trade, a cruel balance. The lake gave Jake his son back, but only so it could take him again when it was ready. "You're not taking him," Jake said, stepping forward. The thing didn't move. Water dripped from its hands, pooling at its feet, but it didn't close the distance. It was waiting, not for Jake, but for Matthew. Because Matthew was the one who made the deal. Jake turned, kneeling in front of his son. "Buddy," his voice softened, though the fear still throbbed beneath it. "You've got to tell me the truth. What happened at the lake? What did they promise you?" Matthew's lip trembled, tears welling. "They said I could see you again, just for a little while, but I had to stay with them after." Jake's stomach dropped. Stay with who? Matthew's eyes flicked to the thing in the center of the room, the ones under the water. Jake's fingers curled into fists. "You were just a kid. You didn't know what you were agreeing to." The thing's voice rippled through the room, layered like dozens of voices speaking through waterlogged lungs. "A promise made at the edge of the lake is binding." Jake stood, squaring his shoulders. "Not if I break it." The thing's smile didn't falter, but the whispering changed tone. Less amused, more hungry. The water on the floor started moving, crawling up the walls, tracing the seams between floorboards, like the whole house was becoming part of the lake. The air grew damp and heavy, filled with the smell of rotting leaves and old water. Every breath felt like inhaling the lake itself. "You can't have him," Jake said again, louder this time. "Take me instead." The whispering faltered. Matthew's head shot up. "No." Jake knelt beside him, gripping his face gently. "It's okay, buddy. I'm your dad. It's my job to protect you, even from this." The thing tilted its head again, considering. It took one step forward, water sloshing from its feet, and then another, until it stood just inches from Jake. It raised a hand, palm up. An offer. Jake didn't hesitate. He reached out, placing his hand in its cold, wet grip. It felt like plunging his hand into the lake in the dead of winter. Sharp, biting, too cold to be real. The thing's fingers closed around Jake's hand, and the whispering intensified, filling the house, the pipes, the air itself, until it was all Jake could hear. It wasn't just voices. It was memories. Matthew, gasping for air, small hands reaching for the surface. A shadow beneath the water, arms made of liquid, pulling him down. The lake's hunger. The deal whispered into Matthew's ear. "We'll let you see your father again, but you will always belong to us." Jake clenched his jaw. "You got what you wanted," he said through gritted teeth. "Now leave him alone." The thing's fingers tightened, then pulled. Jake's breath caught as coldness crawled up his arm, spreading through his chest, down his spine, like the lake itself was reaching inside him, claiming him piece by piece. His knees buckled. The floor beneath him wasn't hardwood anymore. It was wet, soft mud, the smell of algae thick in his nostrils. "No," Matthew screamed, launching himself at Jake, small hands clawing at his sleeve. "Don't take him. Don't take my dad." The thing faltered. The whispering stuttered, like a skipping record. Jake gasped, the icy grip loosening, just slightly. Matthew stood between Jake and the thing now, his chest heaving. "I didn't mean it," Matthew cried. "I didn't mean the promise. I just wanted to go home." The thing's face twisted, the fake smile peeling away, black water dripping from its mouth. Its form shuddered, flickering between human and not human. First Matthew's face, then Eddie's, then a dozen others, all faces lost to the lake over the years. A promise made at the edge of the lake is binding. "But he's my dad," Matthew sobbed. "I take it back. I take it all back." The whispering stopped. The thing's face smoothed, the water that held its shape draining back into the floor, until there was nothing left but puddles and silence. Jake slumped, shivering, his breath ragged. Matthew threw his arms around him, clinging tight. "It's okay, buddy," Jake whispered, though his teeth chattered from the cold still clinging to his skin. "It's okay. I've got you." The house creaked. The water was gone. The air felt lighter, clearer, like the house had been holding its breath, and could finally exhale. Maddie appeared in the hallway, her face pale. What the hell just happened? Jake pulled Matthew closer. We broke the deal, he said softly. Together. 1 month later, Jake sold the house. Matthew never asked why. The boy was quieter now, always glancing at the sinks, the drains, the bathtubs. But the whispering was gone. Sometimes, though, Jake caught him pausing at the kitchen faucet, listening. Just in case. They moved to a small rental far from the lake, far from any water deeper than a kiddie pool. Matthew's room was small but safe, and Jake slept with his bedroom door open, always listening for footsteps, always ready. There were no more whispers, no more black water leaking from the walls. But on particularly cold nights, when the house was utterly still, Jake swore he could hear the faintest sound, like a ripple against a dock, or the gentle lap of water on a distant shore. And sometimes, in the dark between midnight and dawn, Jake dreamt of the lake. It was always waiting, because the water never forgets a promise.